Ladies and gentlemen, fellow patriots, and everyone out there who is sick and tired of watching this country crumble while the elites in power laugh all the way to the bank, welcome back. Today we are going to rip the mask off one of the most disgusting, calculated, and infuriating betrayals of the American taxpayer that has ever been exposed on Capitol Hill. We are talking about a heist so massive, so brazen, and so politically insulated that it makes your blood boil just thinking about it. We are diving deep into the absolute rot that has taken hold in the state of Minnesota, a state that was once a beacon of Midwestern values but has now, under the iron grip of Governor Tim Walz and his cronies, turned into a sanctuary for fraud, a playground for criminals, and a death trap for the truth. You work hard for your money. You wake up early, you punch the clock, you pay your taxes, and you play by the rules because that is what decent Americans do. You believe that when the government takes a chunk of your paycheck, it is supposed to go towards roads, towards schools, towards keeping our community safe, or perhaps helping a neighbor who has genuinely fallen on hard times. But what if I told you that while you are tightening your belt, while you are struggling to pay for groceries because of this skyrocketing inflation, your hard-earned dollars are being shoveled by the truckload into the pockets of international criminal networks? What if I told you that the very politicians demanding you pay your fair share are allegedly presiding over a system that launders that money right back into their own campaign war chests? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not some fringe internet rumor. This is coming straight from the halls of Congress, from a hearing that the mainstream media is desperate to ignore because it shatters their entire narrative. We are looking at the transcript of a hearing led by Representative Clay Higgins, a man who knows a thing or two about law and order, a man who does not flinch when he stares into the eyes of corruption. Representative Higgins brought the heat to the Minnesota State Legislature, and what he uncovered is a scandal that should have every single person in the Biden-Harris administration and the Walz administration shaking in their boots. We are talking about billions of dollars, let me repeat that, billions with a B, that were intended to feed poor children, intended to provide child care for struggling families, but were instead siphoned off by a sophisticated immigrant network to buy luxury cars, fund lavish lifestyles, and, most damning of all, bankroll Democratic political candidates. Let's set the stage here because you need to understand the environment that allows this kind of parasite to grow. Minnesota under Tim Walz has become the laboratory for every radical left-wing experiment you can imagine. They preach compassion, they preach equity, and they preach about being a welcoming sanctuary. But as we have seen time and time again, compassion in the language of the modern Democrat Party is just a code word for slush funds. It is a cover story. They create these massive government programs with zero oversight, fill them with cash printed out of thin air which drives up your inflation, and then they open the doors wide. They invite the world in, not to become Americans, not to assimilate, but to feast at the trough that you filled up. Clay Higgins did not mince words during this hearing. He started connecting the dots that the Department of Justice seems terrified to touch. The testimony revealed that there is a specific network, a group that identified the weak points in our welfare system, and they exploited it with military precision. We are talking about child care subsidies. Now, who is going to vote against money for children? Nobody. That is why they use it. It is the perfect human shield. If you question the funding, they call you a monster. They say you hate kids. But while they were shaming you into silence, they were cutting checks to ghost centers, to people who were looking after children that did not exist, funneling cash to entities that were nothing more than fronts for organized crime. And where did that money go? This is where the story shifts from simple fraud to something that looks a lot like treason against the taxpayer. The testimony suggests that these stolen funds were not just staying in Minnesota. They were being wired to overseas accounts. Think about the national security implications of that for a second. American tax dollars, stolen from your pocket, sent across the globe to who knows where, to support who knows what. But it gets worse. A significant portion of that dirty money allegedly stayed right here, cycled back into the American political system to support Democratic candidates. This is the ultimate feedback loop of corruption. They steal your money to get elected, so they can pass more laws to steal more of your money. It is a perpetual motion machine of graft. Representative Higgins was digging into the reality that this was not just a case of a few bad apples. This was systemic. This was industrial-scale theft. And the question that keeps coming up, the question that Higgins was drilling down on, is where was the oversight? Where was the governor? Where was Tim Walz while his state was being looted? Well, according to the witnesses, the administration wasn't just asleep at the wheel, they were actively throwing the passengers overboard. This is the part that should terrify every government employee who still has a shred of integrity. The testimony implicates the Walz administration in a coordinated effort to silence anyone who tried to blow the whistle. We always hear the left talk about protecting whistleblowers, right? They love whistleblowers when it helps them attack a Republican. They love it when some bureaucrat leaks a transcript to damage Donald Trump. But when a brave soul in Minnesota stands up and says, "Hey, wait a minute, we are sending millions of dollars to fraudsters," what happens? Do they get a medal? Do they get a parade? No. They get crushed. The testimony provided to Congress details a campaign of retaliation that is straight out of a mob movie. These whistleblowers, these patriots who were just trying to do their jobs, faced severe criminal retaliation. They were threatened. Their pensions were held hostage. Their livelihoods were targeted. Governor Walz and his attack dogs didn't just want to fire these people, they wanted to destroy them. They wanted to send a message to anyone else who might be thinking about speaking up, keep your mouth shut, look the other way, and let the money flow, or we will ruin you. This is the behavior of a cartel, not a state government. It is the behavior of people who know they are guilty and are desperate to keep the lid on the garbage can. Clay Higgins sees right through it. He knows that when you see retaliation this severe, it is because the secret they are protecting is massive. You don't threaten a man's pension over a clerical error. You destroy a man's career because he found the bodies buried in the basement. The sheer scale of this fraud is mind-boggling, but what is even more disturbing is the cultural and political mechanism that allowed it. The witnesses described an immigrant network that was essentially given the keys to the kingdom. This touches on the third rail of American politics that the Democrats refuse to acknowledge, the intersection of open borders and the welfare state. Milton Friedman told us decades ago that you cannot have open borders and a welfare state simultaneously. It is national suicide. Well, Minnesota is proving him right. When you import millions of people and immediately hook them up to the government for drip, You are creating a breeding ground for this exact type of exploitation. These networks saw a weak leader in Tim Walz. They saw a system designed by people who think money grows on trees. And they took advantage of it. But let's be honest, they didn't do it alone. You don't steal billions of dollars without someone on the inside holding the door open. That is what Higgins is getting at. The allegation that this money was funding Democratic candidates is the smoking gun. It explains the lack of oversight. Why would they audit the very people who are donating to their campaigns? Why would they shut down the fraud if the fraud is paying for their TV ads? It is a conflict of interest so large it blocks out the sun. The media will try to spin this. They will try to say this is just Republican overreach, or that Higgins is being mean, or that these are just unsubstantiated claims. But we have the transcripts. We have the sworn testimony. We have the ruined lives of the whistleblowers as proof. You don't get targeted by the governor's office for making things up, you get targeted for telling the truth that they don't want to hear. The Walz administration, according to this narrative, has been operating like a protection racket. They protect the fraudsters because the fraudsters feed the political machine, and they destroy the good guys because the good guys threaten the cash flow. Clay Higgins is acting as the voice of the forgotten American in this hearing. He represents every guy in Louisiana, in Texas, in Ohio, and yes, in rural Minnesota, who is watching his country be sold out. He is asking the questions that your local paper is too scared to ask. He is demanding accountability for a scheme that effectively takes money from the working class and gives it to a criminal class that has no loyalty to this nation. The involvement of overseas accounts is particularly chilling. We are funding our own destruction. We are sending capital out of the country, weakening our economy, while simultaneously corrupting our political process at home. The focus on the Minnesota state legislature is crucial here too. It is not just the governor. It is the entire apparatus. The legislature, which should be the check on executive power, appears to be complicit or at least willfully ignorant. They held hearings, sure, but what came of them? Did the money stop? Did the people go to jail? Or did the whistleblowers just get fired? The testimony paints a picture of a total institutional failure, a state government that has been completely captured by special interests and radical ideology. They prioritize the rights of the scam artists over the rights of the taxpayers. When you look at the specifics of how they attacked the whistleblowers, it reveals the true nature of the modern left. They are vindictive. They preach tolerance, but they are the most intolerant people on the planet if you dare to question their dogma or their pocketbook. Threatening a person's pension? That is trying to starve them in their old age. That is evil. That is not governance, that is warfare. And that is what we are dealing with. We are in a war for the soul of this country, and the front line right now is the budget of the state of Minnesota. Representative Higgins understands that this is a microcosm of what is happening federally. If they can get away with this in Minnesota, if they can steal billions and silence the critics and face no consequences, they will do it everywhere. Hell, they are probably doing it everywhere already. This is just the one we found. This is the one where the lid blew off because the greed got too out of control. How many other programs are there like this? How many other green energy grants or community outreach funds are just piggy banks for the Democratic National Committee and their friends? The narrative that is emerging from this hearing is clear: the system is rigged. It is rigged against you. It is rigged in favor of the criminal, the illegal, and the corrupt politician. Tim Walz walks around with that "or shucks" demeanor, acting like a high school football coach, but the operation described in this testimony is cold, calculated, and ruthless. You don't accidentally oversee a billion-dollar fraud ring. You don't accidentally fire all the people who try to stop it. That requires intent. That requires a strategy. And let's not forget the victims here. The real victims are not just the taxpayers, but the actual poor people these programs were supposed to help. There are legitimate families in Minnesota who need child care, who need support. But the money meant for them is gone, flown overseas or funneled into a campaign account. The Democrats claim to be the party of the poor, but they are robbing the poor to feed the machine. They are using the suffering of the vulnerable as a pretext to loot the treasury. It is despicable. As we move deeper into this analysis, we are going to break down the specific tactics they used. We are going to look at how they manipulated the paperwork, how they bypassed the checks and balances, and how they utilized the complexity of the bureaucracy to hide their tracks. But make no mistake, the complexity is a feature, not a bug. They make it complicated so you can't follow the money. But Clay Higgins is following the money. And he is bringing us along for the ride. We are peeling back the layers of this rotten onion, folks, and every layer stinks worse than the last. We established that billions were stolen. We established that the Walz administration allegedly covered it up. But now, we need to get into the how. How do you walk out the front door of the state treasury with sacks of cash and nobody stops you? You do it by exploiting the very nature of the bureaucracy that the Democrats built. Representative Higgins zeroed in on the mechanics of this operation, and it is a masterclass in criminal ingenuity meeting government incompetence. The testimony indicates that this specific immigrant network didn't just stumble upon a loophole, they drove a Mack truck through it. They set up what we can only describe as ghost centers. On paper, these were bustling child care facilities, providing food and education to thousands of needy children. They submitted invoices that looked official. They had the right rubber stamps. But in reality? If you drove past these addresses, you wouldn't hear the laughter of children. You'd see empty storefronts. You'd see abandoned warehouses. You'd see residential homes where maybe 5 people lived, yet they were claiming to feed 500. It is the oldest trick in the book, magnified to a level we have never seen before. And why did it work? Because the Minnesota Department of Education, under Governor Walz, seemingly turned off the verification switch. Usually, you have inspectors. You have audits. You have someone whose job it is to say, "Hey, let me go check if these 500 kids actually exist." But that didn't happen. Why? Because, and this is the woke mind virus at work, to question the validity of these claims was likely seen as insensitive. If you question a minority-run nonprofit in a Democrat-run state, you are immediately branded a racist. So the bureaucrats, terrified of being cancelled or fired, just kept signing the checks. They chose political correctness over fiscal sanity, and you paid the price. Higgins brought up the overseas aspect, and I want you to really focus on this because it is terrifying. The testimony states that funds were funneled to overseas accounts. We are not talking about buying a vacation home in the Bahamas. We are talking about wiring cash to regions of the world that are hostile to American interests. When billions of dollars leave the US economy and vanish into the international banking system, we have to ask the hard questions: is this money funding terrorism? Is it funding groups that hate us? We don't know, because the Minnesota government apparently didn't care enough to track it. They were too busy patting themselves on the back for being inclusive while their inclusivity was being used to drain the state dry. And let's look at the kickback scheme. This is the heartbeat of the corruption. The witnesses testified that stolen funds were used to support Democratic political candidates. This is money laundering, plain and simple. Imagine the audacity. They take your tax dollars, give it to a criminal enterprise. The criminal enterprise skims off the top for their luxury cars and overseas wires, and then donates a chunk of the rest back to the very politicians who authorized the funds. It is a perfect circle. It is a closed loop of power retention. This explains why Governor Walz and his allies were so vicious in their retaliation. If this was just about incompetence, they would have fired a few low-level managers and apologized. But you don't destroy whistleblowers over incompetence. You destroy whistleblowers to protect a criminal conspiracy. The testimony described threats to pensions and professional livelihoods. Think about what that does to a person. You spend 20, 30 years working for the state, building up your retirement, playing by the rules. Then you see a crime. You report it, thinking you are doing the right thing. And suddenly, the full weight of the state government comes crashing down on your head. They threaten to take away the money you need to survive in your old age. That is mafia tactics. That is kiss the ring or sleep with the fishes level of intimidation. Clay Higgins, in his questioning, highlighted the absolute moral bankruptcy of this administration. He painted a picture of a governor who is more concerned with his political war chest than the integrity of his state. Tim Walz wants to be on the national stage. He wants to be the vice president. He wants you to trust him with the nuclear codes. But he can't even trust his own Department of Education to not hand out billions to fraudsters? Or worse, did he know exactly what was happening and let it ride because it was funding the party? The skeptic might say, oh, maybe the governor didn't know. Give me a break. When you are talking about this amount of money, a sizable percentage of the state's budget, you know. If you don't know, you are too incompetent to run a lemonade stand, let alone a state. But the retaliation against the whistleblowers proves knowledge. You only retaliate against the people exposing the truth if you are afraid of the truth. If the governor was innocent, he would have thanked those whistleblowers. He would have given them a commendation. Instead, his administration hunted them down. Let's talk about the cultural impact of this. This scandal is a direct result of the Democrat open border, sanctuary state philosophy. They invite people in, promising them the world, and create a system ripe for abuse. The testimony specifically mentions a specific immigrant network. We need to be honest about this. When you don't demand assimilation, when you don't demand adherence to American law and values, and instead you just hand out free money, you are inviting predators. You are putting a "kick me" sign on the back of every taxpayer. This isn't about race, it's about culture and the rule of law. It's about a group of people coming here, looking at our generosity, and seeing it as a weakness to be exploited. And the Democrats are their enablers. Higgins also touched on the role of the Minnesota state legislature. Where were the checks and balances? The Democrats control the legislature too. It is a one-party state. And what happens in a one-party state? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. The legislative committees that should have been grilling these agency heads were likely chaired by the very people receiving the donations from the fraud network. See how that works? I won't look at your books if you keep donating to my re-election fund. It is the Chicago way, brought north to Minnesota. This hearing is a warning shot. It is a glimpse into the future of America if we don't change course. If you want to know what the Green New Deal or any of these other massive federal spending programs will look like, look at Minnesota. It will be billions of dollars printed, handed out to political allies and shell companies, laundered back into campaign donations, and sent overseas, while you get stuck with the bill and the inflation. The mainstream media is complicit by their silence. If a Republican governor had presided over $1 billion fraud scheme and then fired the whistleblowers, it would be on CNN 24/7. They would be camped out on his lawn. They would be demanding impeachment. But because it is Tim Walz, the media darling, the nice guy, it is crickets. They bury the story. That is why Clay Higgins is so important. He is forcing this into the public record. He is making sure that history records this crime. We are watching the deliberate dismantling of the concept of public service. Public service is supposed to be about serving the public. Under this regime, it is about servicing the party. It is about servicing the donor class, even if the donor class is a criminal network. The betrayal is visceral. Every time you pay sales tax in Minnesota, every time you see that deduction on your paycheck, you are unwittingly funding this machine. You are paying for the rope they are using to hang you. But the story doesn't end here. The implications of the severe criminal retaliation mentioned in the transcript are legally explosive. We are talking about potential obstruction of justice. We are talking about racketeering. This isn't just a political scandal, this is a RICO case waiting to happen. If we had a Department of Justice that wasn't weaponized against conservatives, there would be FBI raids happening right now. They would be seizing hard drives in St. Paul. But since we can't rely on the DOJ, we have to rely on patriots like Higgins to shine the light. In the next part of this deep dive, we need to look at the specific victims. Not just the abstract taxpayer, but the real people. The honest daycare providers who couldn't get funding because the fraudsters took it all. The children who got substandard care because the state was looking the other way. And we need to talk about what needs to happen next. How do we hold these people accountable? Because if they walk away from this unscathed, they will only get bolder. This is a battle between the makers and the takers. The makers, you, me, the people who build this country, are being fleeced by the takers, facilitated by the fakers in the governor's mansion. The mask is off. Minnesota is the crime scene, and Tim Walz's fingerprints are all over the weapon. You want to talk about the victims? Let's talk about the victims. The media wants you to believe this is a victimless crime. They want you to think, oh, it's just government money, the government has plenty of money. That is the lie they feed you to keep you complacent. But let me paint a picture for you of the real cost of Tim Walz's corruption. Imagine a single mother in rural Minnesota. She works 2 jobs, maybe waiting tables and cleaning offices, just to keep the lights on. She is desperate for child care so she can keep working, so she doesn't have to go on welfare. She applies for assistance, she looks for a decent center for her kids. And she is told, sorry, the funds are tight, or she finds that the only centers available on paper are these phantom operations that don't actually exist. She is playing by the rules, struggling to survive, while down the street, a fraudster is driving a brand new luxury SUV paid for by the very program that was supposed to help her. That mother is the victim. Her children are the victims. They were robbed. They were robbed by a system that prioritizes the greed of a criminal network over the needs of American citizens. Representative Clay Higgins brought this into sharp focus. The money that was stolen, hundreds of millions, accumulating into billions, didn't just vanish into the ether. It came out of the mouths of American children. It came out of the infrastructure of our communities. Every dollar sent to an overseas bank account is a dollar that wasn't spent on a veteran, wasn't spent on a road, wasn't spent on a school. It is a direct transfer of wealth from the American working class to an international criminal elite. And the Democrats in Minnesota held the door open for them. Let's dig deeper into the ghost centers. This is the part that exposes the absolute rot of the equity agenda. In the name of diversity and inclusion, the Minnesota state agencies lowered their standards. They stopped vetting. They stopped verifying. If an application came in from a certain demographic, it was fast-tracked. To question it was considered bias. So, you had honest, hardworking American business owners, people running legitimate daycares, paying insurance, buying food, hiring staff, who were subjected to rigorous inspections. They were hassled over minor infractions. Meanwhile, these fraudulent centers, which had no children and no staff, were getting checks for millions of dollars a month without a single inspection. This is the two-tiered justice system in action. If you are a law-abiding citizen, the government is a boot on your neck. If you are a politically connected fraudster, the government is a sugar daddy. The honest providers couldn't compete. How do you compete with a competitor who has zero overhead because they have zero product? You can't. So legitimate businesses went under. Good people lost their livelihoods because the state government was subsidizing a criminal monopoly. This is not capitalism, this is state-sponsored racketeering. And where is the Department of Justice? Where is the FBI? That is the question Clay Higgins is screaming from the rooftops. If this were a Republican governor, if this were Ron DeSantis in Florida or Greg Abbott in Texas, and billions of dollars went missing into the hands of an immigrant network, do you think Merrick Garland would be sitting on his hands? Absolutely not. There would be a special counsel appointed by lunchtime. There would be raids. The media would be running breaking news banners 24 hours a day. they would be calling for the governor to be dragged out in handcuffs. But because it is Minnesota, because it is Tim Walz, a man the Democrats are grooming for high office, the federal apparatus is silent. They are protecting their own. This proves that the federal law enforcement agencies have been weaponized. They are not there to stop crime, and they are there to stop Republicans. They will hunt down a grandmother for walking through the Capitol on January 6th, but they will sleep through a billion-dollar heist that funds foreign entities? It is disgraceful. It is a dereliction of duty that borders on treason. The retaliation aspect that Higgins uncovered is the key to understanding the mindset of these people. The witnesses described a coordinated effort to silence whistleblowers. Let's think about the psychology of that. If you are a government official and you find out there is fraud in your department, your natural reaction should be shock and anger at the fraudsters. You should want to catch them. But the reaction of the Walz administration was anger at the messengers. Why? Because the fraud was a feature, not a bug. The fraud was the plan. When those brave employees tried to stop the payments, they were interfering with the revenue stream of the Democratic Party. Remember the testimony, stolen funds, allegedly used to support Democratic political candidates. That is the line that changes everything. That is the smoking gun. The whistleblowers weren't just exposing a crime, they were cutting off the cash flow to the political machine. That is why they had to be destroyed. That is why their pensions were threatened. In the world of the left, loyalty to the party is more important than the law, more important than morality, more important than the truth. Clay Higgins is fighting a lonely battle here. He is up against a media that refuses to cover the story and a bureaucracy that refuses to investigate itself. But he is armed with the facts. The transcript reveals that the specific immigrant network was sophisticated. They knew the system better than the people running it. Or, more likely, they were coached. You don't just guess how to bypass complex state verification systems. Someone on the inside likely helped. Someone gave them the playbook. Here is how you fill out the form. Here is who you bribe. Here is where you send the kickback. The term kickback is ugly, but it fits. When money goes from the taxpayer to the fraudster, and then back to the politician's campaign, that is a kickback loop. It turns the government into a money laundering operation. And what does this say about the integrity of our elections? If Democratic candidates are being funded by hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen taxpayer money, are those elections fair? Of course not. They are buying their seats with your money. They are using the fruits of crime to secure their power. We also need to address the national security threat. The testimony mentioned overseas accounts. This is the ultimate America Last policy. We are bleeding wealth. We are taking the productivity of the American worker, the sweat, the hours, the sacrifice, and we are shipping it abroad. We are funding our competitors. We might even be funding our enemies. And the Minnesota government, under the leadership of Tim Walz, acted as the wire transfer agent. They didn't just let it happen, they facilitated it by removing the safeguards. This is why the concept of sanctuary state is so dangerous. It is not just about being nice to immigrants. It is about creating a zone of lawlessness where normal rules don't apply. In a sanctuary state, the identity of the recipient is secondary to the virtue signaling of the giver. They didn't care who was getting the money, as long as the checks were clearing and the political donations were coming in. They sacrificed the safety and financial security of the people of Minnesota on the altar of political correctness. Clay Higgins sees the precedent this sets. If they get away with this in Minnesota, it becomes the blueprint. Every blue state in the country will look at this and say, "Hey, that worked. We can loot the treasury, fund our campaigns, silence the opposition, and the media will cover for us." It creates a perverse incentive structure where corruption is rewarded and honesty is punished. It signals the end of the republic as we know it. The witnesses in this hearing were terrified. You could read it in the transcript. They were risking everything to speak up. And what is their reward? The Walz administration tries to ruin them. This is the behavior of tyrants. It is the behavior of dictatorships we see in the Third World, not in the American Midwest. Tim Walz tries to project this image of a Midwestern dad, a coach, a regular guy. But a regular guy doesn't oversee a billion-dollar fraud ring. A regular guy doesn't threaten the pensions of civil servants who are just doing their jobs. That is the behavior of a political boss, a mob enforcer. We have to ask ourselves, is this the future we want for our country? Because if Tim Walz ascends to the vice presidency, this is what he brings with him. He brings the Minnesota model to Washington, D.C. Imagine this level of fraud, but on a federal scale. Imagine trillions, not billions, being siphoned off to networks and NGOs and overseas accounts, while your taxes double and your services vanish. Imagine the FBI and the DOJ being used to hunt down anyone who dares to question where the money went. That is the stakes of this investigation. Clay Higgins is trying to warn us. He is ringing the alarm bell. He is showing us the anatomy of the steal. It starts with a compassionate-sounding program, child care for the poor. It is implemented with loose rules in the name of equity. It is exploited by organized criminal networks. The proceeds are shared with the political party in power. And the cover-up is enforced by ruthless retaliation. It is a perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem of corruption. And don't forget the role of the Minnesota legislature. They are the enablers. They sat in their comfortable chairs, took their per diem checks, and watched the state burn. They held sham hearings where they nodded along and pretended to care, but they did nothing to stop the flow of cash. They are just as guilty as the executive branch. It is a failure of the entire political class in that state. They have become so incestuous, so comfortable in their one-party rule, that they have lost all fear of the voters. They think they are untouchable. But the truth has a way of coming out. Thanks to Higgins, the cracks are forming in the dam. The skeptic might ask, why now? Well, maybe because the theft became too big to hide. Maybe because the arrogance of the fraudsters got out of hand. They got sloppy. They bought too many cars, too many houses. They flaunted it. And even the most terrified bureaucrat eventually reaches a breaking point where they can't stay silent anymore. This story is about the betrayal of trust. You trust your government to be good stewards of your money. That trust has been shattered. You trust your leaders to protect you from criminals. That trust has been betrayed. Instead, they partnered with the criminals. You trust the system to be fair. That trust is gone. The system is rigged. As we move into the final act of this analysis, we need to talk about the solution. We can't just be angry, we have to be strategic. What needs to happen to clean up this mess? It starts with a complete and total audit. Not a fake audit by the state, but a federal forensic audit. It requires the dismantling of the networks that perpetrated this. And yes, it requires prosecutions. Real jail time. Not just for the foot soldiers who cashed the checks, but for the politicians who signed them. The suits in the state capitol need to trade their tailored jackets for orange jumpsuits. Until we see politicians doing the perp walk, nothing will change. We need to make Clay Higgins the standard. We need more lions in Congress and fewer lambs. We need people who aren't afraid to be called names by the New York Times. Because at the end of the day, they are stealing your country from right under your nose. And they are using your own money to do it. You are watching the collapse of accountability in real time. We have established the crime, $1 billion heist. We have established the cover-up, the ruthless crushing of whistleblowers. But now we have to talk about the endgame. What happens when a government decides that its own survival is more important than the law? What happens when the people in charge stop fearing the voters and start fearing the criminals they are in bed with? That is the terrifying reality of the state of Minnesota under Tim Walz, and it is a preview of what they want to do to the entire United States of America. Think about the sheer logistics of stealing hundreds of millions of dollars. You don't just stuff it in a mattress. You need a network. You need lawyers. You need accountants. You need people on the inside to look the other way. This wasn't some guy in a basement printing fake checks. This was an enterprise. Representative Higgins knows this. When he talks about the specific immigrant network, he is talking about a sophisticated operation that likely has ties to international organizations. These people came here, they saw a weak governor, they saw a woke legislature, and they set up shop. They turned Minnesota into the world's ATM. And the silence from the governor's mansion is deafening. Usually, when a scandal this big breaks, the politician tries to get out in front of it. They hold a press conference. They vow to get to the bottom of it. But not Walz. Why? Because he can't. He can't get to the bottom of it because he is sitting on top of it. The testimony implicates his administration in the retaliation. If he admits there was fraud, he has to admit he failed to stop it. If he admits there was retaliation, he has to admit his administration is corrupt. So he does the only thing he can do, he bunkers down, he attacks the messengers, and he prays that the media keeps covering for him. Let's go back to the overseas accounts. This keeps keeping me up at night. We are sending American wealth to foreign lands. In a time of global instability, where we have enemies in the Middle East, in China, in Russia, we are allowing our own tax dollars to leak out of the country like a sieve. Clay Higgins is practically begging the federal government to look into this. Where did that money go? Did it buy weapons? Did it fund extremist madrasas? Did it go into the pockets of warlords? We don't know. And the fact that we don't know is a national disgrace. The Minnesota government didn't just lose money, they lost control of where American resources are going. They acted as a financier for potential adversaries. The skeptics and neutrals will tell you to wait for the courts. They will say, innocent until proven guilty. That is fine for a court of law. But in the court of public opinion, in the court of common sense, the verdict is already in. You don't threaten a whistleblower's pension unless you are guilty. That is the tell. That is the poker player shaking his hand because he is bluffing. The ferocity of the retaliation tells you the value of the secret. They were willing to destroy human lives to keep those checks coming. That is not governance, that is gangsterism. Compare this to the great political machines of the past. Think of Tammany Hall in New York. They were corrupt, sure. They stole money. But even Boss Tweed would be blushing at the scale of this. At least Tammany Hall built some buildings. At least they paved some streets. The Walls machine is stealing billions and giving you nothing but inflation and crime. They are looting the store and burning it down on their way out. And they are doing it with a smile. They are doing it while lecturing you about moral superiority. That is the part that really stings. They steal your money and then call you a bigot if you complain about it. This hearing with Clay Higgins is a historical document. 50 years from now, historians will look back at this transcript and say, this was the moment. This was the moment when the American state-level government ceased to function as a representative body and became a predatory organism. It marks the transition from a republic to a kleptocracy, a rule by thieves. And make no mistake, it is contagious. If Minnesota falls, who is next? Michigan? Wisconsin? Pennsylvania? The rot spreads. The networks talk to each other. Hey, go to Minnesota, the door is unlocked. Hey, go to Illinois, they don't check IDs. We need to talk about the Democratic candidates mentioned in the testimony. This is the engine of the machine. Money is the mother's milk of politics. If you can fund your campaign with stolen taxpayer dollars, you have an infinite war chest. You can outspend your opponent 10 to 1. You can buy every commercial slot. You can hire every consultant. It destroys the concept of a fair election. How is a Republican challenger supposed to compete with a Democrat who is effectively being funded by the state treasury via a money laundering fraud ring? They can't. It is a rigged game. It is a way to ensure a permanent one-party state. And that is the goal. They want a one-party state. They look at California and they salivate. They want total control. They want to be able to pass whatever insane laws they want without any opposition. And to get there, they need money. Massive amounts of money. So they turn a blind eye to the fraud, or they actively encourage it, because they know a cut of that action is coming back to them. It is a symbiotic relationship between the politician and the parasite. The politician feeds the parasite with your tax dollars, and the parasite feeds the politician with donations. And the host, the American taxpayer, slowly dies. Clay Higgins is one of the few people in Washington who understands the visceral anger of the American people. He knows that people are struggling. He knows that the price of eggs is up, the price of gas is up, and mortgages are unaffordable. And then he sees this. He sees billions being wasted. It is an insult. It is a slap in the face to every family that sits at the kitchen table trying to balance their checkbook. You are budgeting down to the penny, and Tim Walz is leaving the vault door open. We must demand a federal intervention. This cannot be left to the state of Minnesota to investigate. You cannot ask the fox to investigate the henhouse. We need a special counsel. We need the forensic accountants. We need to freeze the assets of everyone involved. Every car, every house, every boat bought with this stolen money needs to be seized and sold, and the money returned to the taxpayers. And the pensions of the politicians who allowed this? Maybe those should be the ones threatened. Maybe Tim Walz's pension should be on the line, not the whistleblowers. Let's flip the script. Imagine if the whistleblowers were the ones in charge. Imagine if we had a government run by the people who were brave enough to speak up. That is the government we deserve. But instead, we have a system that weeds out the honest and promotes the corrupt. If you are honest in the Walz administration, you get fired. If you are corrupt, you get promoted. It is a perverse incentive structure that guarantees a downward spiral of competency. Eventually, nobody in the government will know how to do anything except steal. The immigrant network aspect is uncomfortable for some people to talk about, but we have to face it. It is a failure of assimilation. We are bringing people into this country who do not share our values of honesty and hard work. They come from cultures where scamming the government is a sport or a survival mechanism. And instead of teaching them this is America, we don't do that here. The Democrats say, here is the form, here is the money, go ahead. They are corrupting the immigrants too. They are teaching them that America is a land of suckers. They are teaching them that crime pays. This hearing is a call to arms for every patriot. We cannot just watch this on YouTube and shake our heads. We have to get involved. We have to support representatives like Clay Higgins who are willing to ask the tough questions. We have to primary the rhinos, Republicans in name only, who refuse to hold these hearings. We have to demand that our local media cover these stories. Share this video. Post the transcript. Make it impossible for them to hide. The future of the country is at stake. I know that sounds dramatic, but look at the numbers. Billions here, billions there. Pretty soon you are talking about real money. You are talking about the solvency of our nation. You are talking about the moral fiber of our society. If we accept this, if we shrug and say, well, that's just politics, then we are finished. We have to get angry. We have to get loud. We have to tell Tim Walz and his cronies that the party is over. The whistleblowers are the heroes of this story. Let's never forget that. Ordinary people who saw something wrong and risked everything to stop it. They are the spirit of America. They are the people who storm the beaches and run into burning buildings. They did their duty. Now it is time for us to do ours. We must vindicate them. We must ensure that their sacrifice was not in vain. We must make sure that the people who tried to destroy them are brought to justice. Representative Higgins ended his questioning, but the investigation must not end. We need to follow the money all the way to the top. Does it stop at the governor's office? Or does it go higher? Does it go to the DNC in Washington? Does it go to the NGOs that are trafficking people across the southern border? Everything is connected. The open border, the welfare state, the election integrity issues, it is all one giant web of corruption. And this Minnesota scandal is just one thread. But if we pull on it hard enough, the whole thing might unravel. So, here is my challenge to you. Do not let this story die. The mainstream media is counting on your short attention span. They are counting on the next news cycle to distract you. Do not let them. Keep asking, where is the money? Who authorized it? Why were the whistleblowers fired? Put these questions on billboards. Put them on t-shirts. Ask them at town halls. Make Tim Walz answer. Make the Democrats answer. We are the majority. We are the people who work and pay taxes and love this country. They are the minority who steal and lie and hate what America stands for. But they are organized, and they are ruthless. We have to be tougher. We have to be smarter. We have to be relentless. Clay Higgins has given us the ammunition. Now we have to fire the shot. This is not just about Minnesota. This is about taking back our country from a political class that views us as cattle to be milked. It is about restoring the rule of law. It is about saving the American dream from becoming a nightmare of corruption. The line is drawn. On one side, you have Tim Walz, the fraudsters, and the media that protects them. On the other side, you have the whistleblowers, Clay Higgins, and the American people.